In western Nebraska, the wind did not arrive like weather. It arrived like a debt collector. It crossed the table-flat grassland from the northwest, picked up snow as fine as ground glass, and pushed it through every seam a poor man had failed to seal. It turned chimney smoke sideways. It made doors tremble on their hinges. It found the soft places in a cabin and pressed its cold fingers through. And on an October morning in 1884, while every other settler within 8 miles was trying to break more sod before freeze-up, Silas Redfern was on his knees in a trench planting cedar seedlings in a crooked half-moon around a shack, not in a straight row, not along a fence line, not where anyone sensible would plant shade. He planted them with the bend facing the winter wind. A neighbor watched from his wagon and laughed hard enough that his team flicked their ears. "Redfern," he called, "you cannot eat cedar needles." Silas did not look up. His hands were raw. His coat was thin. Behind him stood a cabin 12 feet by 15, chinked with mud that had cracked before the first hard frost. Behind that cabin was a little grave marked with a broken plow handle, because there was no stone to buy and no timber worth carving. Silas pressed the seedling roots into wet clay, closed both fists around the soil, and said the only answer he had: no. But a stove can. That was the thing nobody understood. Silas was not planting trees for shade. He was not decorating the claim. He was not trying to please the tree inspector or win a law written by men who did not live where the wind could knock a child flat. He was trying to make the wind spend its strength somewhere else. The homestead lay 15 miles from the nearest real town and 7 miles from the nearest dependable timber. The first cabin on that quarter section had been thrown up by a man who filed, lost heart, and sold his improvement rights for $18 and a harness collar. Silas paid $11 cash and promised the rest after harvest, even though there was no harvest yet, only prairie sod tough enough to turn a plow blade blue. He came with his wife Lydia, 2 children, a spotted mule named Bishop, 1 box stove with a warped door, a trunk of tools, and $34 folded inside a Bible. Silas had not been born to Prairie. He had grown up in a Pennsylvania mill hollow where water did the work. Water turned wheels. Water carried logs. Water made men rich when they understood it, and ruined them when they only tried to block it. His father had tended a sawmill on a creek that flooded every spring, and Silas learned early that a dam did not defeat moving water. A dam made water choose a path. That lesson followed him west. But Lydia did not survive the first winter. The cough began in December. It sounded ordinary at first, a dry sound in the dark while the stove burned low. By January, it had deepened into her chest. Silas hung blankets from the rafters to trap heat around the bed. He burned through cordwood faster than he could haul it. He cut buffalo grass for chinking. He stuffed rags under the door. He set the stove so hot the warped iron glowed red along the seam. It was not enough. The wind took the heat as fast as he could make it. Lydia Redfern died before dawn on February 9th, 1885, with one hand on her son's sleeve and the other curled under the quilt she had sewn back east. She was 28. The ground was frozen 19 inches deep. Silas dug her grave with a mattock, a kettle of boiling water, and a patience that looked to his children like madness. He buried her on a low rise south of the cabin where the snow did not drift as hard, and he marked the place with the broken handle from the plow that had already failed him twice. His daughter Clara was 9. His son Toby was 6. Neither of them asked when they were going home. Children on the prairie learned quickly that questions could spend a parent's last strength. By March, Silas had $18 left, half a cord of cottonwood, 3 sacks of cornmeal, a mule that needed oats, and a debt at Hollis Keene's store that grew interest the way thistles grew after rain. He also had the wind. Every day, the same wind. It came down from the northwest across open miles, with no hill, no grove, no barn, no stack of hay, nothing between the horizon and his cabin wall. It did not simply make the house cold. It made the house lose the fight. The stove had to work too hard. The firewood vanished too fast. Smoke backed into the room when gusts hit the pipe wrong. Frost formed on the inside of the north wall, then melted by the stove, then froze again when the fire sank. A house could fail slowly. Silas was living inside one. In April, the government tree inspector came. His name was Gideon Pike, and he had the hard, narrow face of a man paid to count failure. He had inspected claims from the Platte to the Niobrara, and had seen more dead seedlings than living ones. He walked Silas's quarter section with a small notebook, stepping over the old furrows and the empty woodpile, and the frozen ruts where the mule had dragged cottonwood from the creek bottom. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Lydia's grave. He looked at the 2 children carrying dried dung in a flour sack for fuel. Then he said, "Without cruelty, this place will use you up." Silas said nothing. Pike pressed his thumb into the cabin, chinking at the northwest corner. The mud broke loose in flakes. "You do not have shelter," Pike said. "You have a box the wind has not finished opening." The words were harsh because they were accurate. Pike counted what Silas needed. 5 cords of fuel before Christmas, new stove hinges, 2 barrels of flour, seed wheat, nails, mule feed, and a roof patch before spring thaw made the sod cover cave inward. The numbers did not add together. They stacked against him. Then Silas told him he had filed a timber culture entry. Pike shut the notebook. "Trees?" he asked. "Yes." "On this ground?" "Yes." The inspector looked northwest, where nothing stood taller than winter grass. "Mr. Redfern, I have seen men plant cottonwood by the thousand and lose them by August. Rain lies out here. Grass steals water. Wind pulls saplings sideways before they learn the ground. A man with 2 children and no wife cannot wait 10 years for a grove." Silas finally looked at him. "I am not waiting for a grove. I am building a break." Pike did not understand the word the way Silas meant it. To him, a break was brush, a thicket, a place birds hid. To Silas, from mill country, a break was anything that stole speed from a moving force before it reached the thing that mattered. Water through stone, saw teeth through timber, wind through trees. Pike shook his head. "Rows, maybe," he said, "if you can keep them alive. A proper shelter row on the north side." Silas looked at the cabin door, then at the grass lying flat toward the southeast. "A row stands there and takes the blow. That is the point." "No," Silas said. "That is the problem." The inspector stared at him long enough to decide whether he was hearing foolishness or grief. He wrote one line in his book. Claimant proposes irregular wind planting. Survival doubtful. Then he mounted his horse and left Silas with a warning. Sell while someone will still take the place. Grief has made better men think a bad idea was a promise. The idea had not come from grief. It came from 3 small observations that spring. The first came during a sleet storm in May. Silas had set a broken hayrack panel against a fence post so Clara could scrape dried mud from it. The northwest wind drove sleet hard enough to sting through wool. But behind the slanted panel, the sleet changed. It still fell. It still landed. But it no longer struck like thrown gravel. The panel did not stop the storm. It made the storm point spend force turning. Silas stood there until his fingers went numb. The second came inside the cabin a week later. Toby had hung Lydia's apron from a peg near the stove. The cabin door was open to let smoke clear after another bad draft. Before the apron moved, the flame in the stove throat flickered and coughed. After it moved, the air changed. The draft steadied. The apron did not block the wind. It broke the straight line of it. The third came from memory. Silas remembered his father at the mill, standing by the spillway in spring flood, pointing at the water, curling around a stone pier. "Never meet a force square if you can make it turn," his father had said. "Once it turns, it pays." That night, when the children slept, Silas took stove charcoal and drew on the inside wall. Not a square grove, not a line, a crescent. Its open mouth faced southeast, toward the cabin. Its thick, blunt curve faced northwest into the wind. The center of the arc began 300 feet from the cabin. The 2 arms swept back along the north and west sides, leaving 75 feet of open pocket before the house. The shape looked less like a wall than a bent comb. A straight row would catch wind and throw turbulence behind it. Silas wanted the opposite. He wanted the first trees to split the blow. He wanted the outer curve to scatter the current sideways. He wanted the staggered rows behind it to slow what remained. He wanted the snow to drop between the trees and the cabin, not against the door. He wanted the stovepipe to breathe an air that had already lost the worst of its anger. He wrote numbers beside the drawing because hope without numbers was just weather talk. Outer row, red cedar, 6 feet apart. Second row, spruce if he could get it, 10 feet back and staggered. Inner nurse row, willow and box elder, fast-growing, cheap, forgiving. Clear pocket, 75 feet to the cabin. No gaps. A gap was not emptiness. A gap was a throat, and wind loved a throat. He began marking the curve with willow stakes the next morning. That was when Caleb Thorne rode over and laughed. Caleb owned the adjoining claim and had 60 acres of wheat coming in clean. He was not mean. He was practical, which can feel the same when a man is drowning. He sat on his wagon and watched Silas sight the stakes by chimney smoke. "You came for wheat ground," Caleb said. "Now you are bending it into a garden. Not a garden. What then? A break." Caleb spat into the grass. "Trees take years. Winter takes no such courtesy." Silas had no answer good enough to win the moment. He only had the kind of answer that takes years to prove. "I cannot keep buying back the same heat," he said. Caleb did not laugh at that, because every settler understood fuel. A cord bought from the creek cutters cost $4, more if the road iced early. A cord hauled by mule cost 2 days, sometimes 3. A loose cabin could eat 6 cords in a hard winter and still never feel warm. Silas was not merely cold. He was being taxed by wind. Every gust took wood from his pile, labor from his body, money from his future. Caleb looked at the stakes again. "Plant wheat first," he said. "Get ahead. Then plant your trees." Silas looked at Lydia's grave. "If I wait until I am ahead, I will never plant them." The first seedlings came from Hollis Keene's store in July. Keene was a broad man with a polished counter and a smile that made credit feel like a trap before the paper was signed. He sold flour, harness oil, nails, seed, ironware, and time was the dear item. He had Silas's name in his ledger already. That made Silas a customer and a prisoner. Silas asked for 200 red cedar seedlings and 50 spruce. Keene repeated the order loudly enough for the men by the Cracker Barrel to hear. "Spruce," he said, "for a man who cannot afford oats." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they want permission to laugh. Keene turned the ledger towards Silas. "Your account stands at $21.70. I can cut rails. I have men who cut rails faster. I can haul. You have 1 mule." Silas said nothing. Keene tapped the page. "I will order your little forest. I will add it to the note. But understand this, Redfern. If those trees do what most trees do here, I will own the ground they died on." Then he smiled. "What shall I call it on the order?" Silas said. "Cedar." Keene said, "No, I mean the scheme." One of the men by the stove muttered, "Redfern's broom." The name stuck before the seedlings even arrived. Redfern's broom, a thing meant to sweep wind, a thing everyone expected to break. The first planting nearly proved them right. Silas broke the sod with Bishop until the mule's shoulders steamed in the morning cold. He dug trenches where the plow could not reach. Clara carried water in 2 small pails from the draw, 200 yards each way. Toby dragged slough hay for mulch and fell asleep at supper, with dirt dried on his cheeks. Silas planted the first cedar row too shallow. He did not know it yet. He pressed the roots in by hand, shaped small basins around each stem, and shaded the bundles with wet burlap. He worked before sunrise and after dusk because July heat could kill a seedling before noon. Every plant went into the curve like a letter in a sentence nobody else was going to read. By mid-August, the sentence was missing words. 48 seedlings yellowed. 27 died. Some dried at the root. Some leaned until the stem cracked. Some were strangled by prairie grass that drank first and left nothing for cedar roots finer than horsehair. Silas pulled one dead plant from the soil and felt how light it was. Dead cedar weighed almost nothing. That hurt him more than he expected. Not because of the money. Not only the money, because every dead seedling was a future opening in the living break, and every opening was a place the wind would remember. He stood at the center of the curve one hot evening and looked back toward the cabin. The seedlings were pathetic, scattered green marks barely higher than his boot. The cabin still shook in every gust. The stove still smoked when the draft was wrong. Lydia was still in the ground, and the winter he was trying to defeat was already coming. Then Annika Madsen arrived on foot. She was 60 years old, Danish, widowed twice, and known along the Loop River settlements for keeping more trees alive than men half her age. She carried a canvas sack, a spade, and the expression of someone who had no interest in being welcomed before she knew whether welcome was deserved. She walked straight past Silas and knelt beside a yellowing cedar. Without asking, she gripped the stem near the soil and lifted. The seedling came up too easily. "Roots dried before planting," she said. Silas stared at her. She turned the root ball in her hand. "Also, your basin is a saucer for ants, not water." Toby laughed once, then hid behind Clara because Annika looked at him. Silas asked her name. She gave it and nothing more. Then she pointed to the clay at the draw. "Bring water." For 3 days, Anika remade Silas's understanding of trees. She taught him to puddle roots in clay slurry until every fine hair was coated before planting. She taught him to cut a basin 18 inches wide and 3 inches deep, with the downhill lip packed firm enough to hold snowmelt. She taught him to strip prairie grass in a ring around each seedling, because the grass was not scenery. It was competition. She taught him to mulch with spoiled hay and manure, thin enough not to rot the stem, thick enough to hold dampness through wind. A tree on prairie does not die because the sky hates it, Anika said. It dies because the ground around it takes the drink first. She inspected Silas's charcoal crescent on the cabin wall. He expected dismissal. Instead, she traced the curve with one finger. Good, she said. That single word did more for Silas than any comfort had done since Lydia died. Then Anika added, too short on the west arm. Silas blinked. She pointed toward the drawing. When the wind turns, it will curl around that end and come back at your door. A short shelter is a crooked fence. A long shelter is a room with one side open. She stayed long enough to fix the worst mistakes and left before Silas could offer payment he did not have. At the road, she turned. Plant more than you need, she said. Losses are not accidents here. They are part of the count. That became the rule. The first year ended with 430 seedlings in the ground and 112 dead. The second year began with replanting. The third year, grasshoppers chewed the box elder leaves down to green lace but ignored the cedars. The fourth year, drought tightened the basins into cracked bowls, and Silas hauled water after midnight because daytime hauling wasted too much to sun and wind. The fifth year, Toby broke 2 fingers under a water barrel, and Clara finished the mule chores without being asked. She was 14 then, quiet as a closed door, already carrying the kind of competence that childhood should not require. Every spring, Silas replaced failures. Every summer, he weeded rings. Every fall, he banked mulch around the roots and cut brush panels at the weak ends of the curve. The crescent grew unevenly. The willows shot up first, tall and flexible. The box elders widened. The cedars were stubborn, slow, dark, and worth every hour. The spruce filled in behind them like green smoke thickening into walls. At Keene's store, the joke changed tone. At first, men called it Redfern's broom and laughed. By the fourth year, they called it that without laughing. By the fifth, they stopped calling it anything where Silas could hear, because from the road the shape had become visible. A dark bent line on open prairie, a living curve aimed at the northwest. Gideon Pike returned in September of 1889. He had not grown kinder, only older. He walked the crescent from the windward side, counting trunks and measuring spacing with his stride. The tallest willows were nearly 14 feet. The cedars were 8 to 10 where the soil held, shorter where drought had punished them. The spruce were thick enough in places that Silas could no longer see the cabin through the rows. Pike stopped at the blunt center of the curve and looked toward the open northwest. Better survival than I expected, he said. Silas understood this was praise in the inspector's language. Then Pike added, a normal blow is not proof. What is? Killing one. The sentence sat between them. Pike pointed with his pencil. When the wind is 45 miles an hour, the temperature below zero, and the snow dry enough to move like sand, you will learn whether you made shelter or only planted a dark shape. Silas had known that. Every cloth strip he had hung from posts told him the crescent changed something. On windy days, the exposed strip outside the curve snapped straight as a whip, while the strip near the cabin lifted and dropped. The stove drafted cleaner in ordinary blows. Snow collected in soft fans between the trees and the house instead of packing against the wall. But Pike was right. A test like that could not be arranged. It arrived. It arrived on January 12, 1890. At dawn, the sky was pale and hard. By noon, the clouds to the northwest had formed a dark, clean edge, the kind of edge old settlers stopped work to watch. The temperature fell from 20 above to 5 in less than 3 hours. Then it kept falling. By 3 o'clock, the wind had become one continuous pressure, not gusts. A pressure. The snow was powder-fine and horizontal, flying so low it seemed to come from the ground as much as the sky. The chimney smoke flattened and disappeared into it. The cabin walls began their old trembling, but not the way they had trembled before the trees grew. The sound was lower now, more distant, like a wagon crossing a bridge far off. The crescent had taken the first voice of the storm. Clara was sick. That was the private terror inside the public one. She had been coughing for 4 days, and by afternoon her skin burned under Silas's palm. He wrapped her in quilts near the stove and fed the fire with the best oak he had saved from a trade with a creek man. Her breath rasped in the same pattern Lydia's had 10 years before, and Silas felt the old winter open inside him like a door. He could survive ridicule. He could survive debt. He was not sure he could survive hearing that cough again. Toby made the first wood run at 3:30. He was 11 now, long-legged and serious, and when he opened the door, the cold shoved into the room. He crossed to the south stack, filled both arms, came back with ice in his eyebrows. "The trees are roaring," he said. Silas heard them, not creaking, not snapping, roaring, hundreds of branches, thousands of needles, the whole living curve taking the force together. On the exposed side, the storm hammered. On the leeward side, where the cabin stood, the wind moved broken and uneven, still cold, still dangerous, but no longer carrying the full fist of the plains. The stove drew clean. That was the first proof that mattered. In every bad winter before the crescent, a northwest blow made the stove cough smoke. Gusts struck the pipe, reversed the draft, and filled the cabin with gray bitterness until the children coughed harder than the fire burned. But that night, while the storm slammed against the cedar curve, the pipe breathed steadily. The flame stayed bright. The room held heat, not warmth enough for comfort, warmth enough for time. At 6 o'clock, Silas saw a lantern through the side window. It appeared once, vanished, then appeared lower to the ground. Someone was out in the storm. Silas opened the door and stepped into the sheltered pocket. The cold struck his face, but he could stand. He could breathe. He could see the nearest cedar row shaking under its white load. Snow moved along the outside of the curve in 2 streams, racing around the bend like water around a rock. Beyond the trees, the world was gone. He tied Lydia's old scarf across his mouth, took a coil of rope from the wall, and moved toward the west arm. 20 yards beyond the last spruce, the storm hit him full. It was not wind anymore. It was a moving wall. Silas leaned forward and still slid backward. Snow filled the corner of his eye and cut along his cheek. He dropped to one knee, found the frozen rut he knew by boot memory, and followed it toward Caleb Thorne's claim. The lantern belonged to Caleb's hired boy, Martin, who had tried to reach Silas after Caleb's stovepipe cap tore loose. Caleb's wife was inside, holding a blanket over the pipe hole, while smoke and cold poured into the cabin together. Martin had gotten lost between the two claims and gone down in the snow. Silas found him curled beside a drift, one mitten gone. He tied the rope under the boy's arms and dragged him back toward the crescent. The moment they crossed the line of cedar, Martin began breathing differently. Not easily, but humanly. The wind dropped from a killing force to a rough shove. Silas hauled him into the cabin and put him beside the stove, then went back out before Toby could beg him not to. He had to reach Caleb. The crossing almost killed him. Caleb's cabin sat only a few hundred yards away, but open distance in that storm had become another country. Silas walked bent so low, his hand brushed the snow. Twice he fell. Once he lost the rope and had to crawl in a circle until his fingers found it. When he reached Caleb's wall, he saw the problem immediately. The pipe cap was gone, the wind was pouring down through the opening, and smoke had blackened the ceiling beams. Caleb was outside on the roof, trying to lash a board over the pipe, his hands too numb to tie. Silas had carried a square of oiled canvas in his coat for years, a mill habit from his father. He shoved Caleb aside, threw the canvas over the pipe opening, and tied it down with the rope through two nail heads already frozen into place. The canvas snapped like a trapped animal, bellied hard, then held. Inside, Caleb's wife, Sarah, was gray with exhaustion from holding the blanket. Their smallest girl had stopped crying, which was worse than crying. "Bring them," Silas said. Caleb looked at the white world beyond the door. "My house. Your house is losing heat faster than you can make it. Mine is not." That was the first time Silas had said it aloud. Mine is not. They crossed as 5 shapes tied together by rope. Silas first. Caleb behind him, carrying the child under his coat. Sarah between Caleb and Martin. The open ground punished them. It shoved Sarah sideways, drove Caleb to his knees, packed snow into Silas's collar until his back burned with cold. But then the cedar curve appeared as a dark blur in the white. They reached the west arm. The change was immediate. Not peace, not calm. A reduction, the kind a body recognizes before the mind can measure it. Sarah stopped walking and looked up through frost-white lashes. "What is this?" she whispered. Silas could barely hear her. "The trees," Caleb said. His voice sounded stunned, almost angry. "The trees are taking it." Inside the Redfern cabin, 7 people and 1 sick girl crowded around a stove that still drew clean. Martin's fingers thawed in a bowl of water. Sarah held her child beside Clara. Toby fed the fire in small, careful charges the way Silas had taught him, never choking the draft, never letting flame race too high. At midnight, Silas stepped outside to check the line. The storm had buried the outer center of the crescent under a drift almost 5 feet high. Snow packed against the windward cedar trunks like plaster. The branches bowed but held. Along the arms, the snow had been carried sideways and dropped in long white ridges outside the shelter. Inside the pocket near the cabin, there was only a soft, even layer. The door opened. The roof was clear. The wood stack was reachable. The stove was alive. Silas stood there with ice in his beard and realized the crescent had not stopped winter. It had done something more useful. It had slowed the rate at which winter could spend him. The cabin lost heat more slowly. The stove ate fuel more slowly. Clara's fever had more hours to break. The people inside had more hours before their hands and lungs and judgment failed. On the frontier, survival was often not a victory. It was a delay long enough for morning to come. Clara's fever broke at 4. She opened her eyes, asked for water, and fell asleep again before Silas could answer. Morning revealed the proof in white. The outside of the crescent was buried in hard drifts, sculpted sharp by the gale. The inner pocket held shallow snow. Between the last row of spruce in the cabin, the open gap Silas had insisted on held a thin, soft fan that would melt into the tree basins when the sun returned. Caleb's cabin, by contrast, was sealed on the northwest wall under 3 feet of packed snow. His woodpile was gone under a drift. His door had to be dug open from inside with a stove shovel. Gideon Pike arrived 3 days later. He did not write at first. He walked the curve, shoved his arm into the drift at the windward center, measured the shallow snow near the cabin, examined the stovepipe, and stood for a long time where the two worlds met. One side hard, white, violent. The other side quiet enough for footprints. Then he said, "Draw it." Silas thought he had misheard. Pike took the notebook from his coat. Draw the curve. Spacing. Species. Distance from the house. Where the snow fell. Where it did not. It was not an apology. Pike was not built for apology. It was better. It was a transfer of authority. The man who had written Survival Doubtful now wanted the doubtful man's design. Silas drew it with a pencil stub on the back of an inspection form. He marked the blunt windward arc, the staggered cedar and spruce, the willow nurse row, the 75-foot pocket. The arms long enough to prevent curlback, the open southeast side so air could leave after slowing. Pike studied it. "This is not a timber claim planting," he said. Silas waited. "It is a machine made of trees." After that, people came. Not all at once. Pride slows men more effectively than distance. Caleb came first because his family had crossed the line and felt the difference in their bones. He did not mention the laughter. Silas did not mention it either. They walked Caleb's claim and marked where the grass bent first in a northwest blow. Silas told him to plant cedar outside, spruce behind, willow only as nurse cover, and never put the dense row too close to the house. "How close?" Caleb asked. "Close enough to tire the wind. Far enough for snow to fall before your wall." Caleb planted cottonwood anyway because cottonwood was free. By the second winter, he understood the mistake. Bare branches in January are not shelter. They are a drawing of shelter. He replanted with cedar from Silas's nursery trench. Anika returned that spring, slower than before, with plum cuttings wrapped in damp cloth. She examined the crescent and gave no praise until she had checked the roots of 3 replacement cedars. Then she said, "Now make the quiet place useful." She planted plums and chokecherries along the sheltered side where the wind had dropped snowmelt in soft fans. Silas saw the lesson at once. The crescent was not only a break. It made a different patch of prairie behind it. Warmer in winter, cooler in summer, wetter after storms, calmer in every season. A pocket. A pocket could hold more than a cabin. Anika showed Clara how to prune the young plums. Clara listened the way a person listens when a new future has entered the room quietly and taken a chair. That was Anika's last visit. She died that summer on her own claim after working a half-day setting willow slips along a creek bank. Silas heard the news from a freighter and found, 2 weeks later, that she had left her pruning knife in the mulch, under the west arm. He cleaned it and kept it in his coat pocket beside the oiled canvas, not as a keepsake, as a tool. Because Anika did not teach sentiment. She taught survival that could be repeated. The next test was fire. In April of 1892, a dry grass fire came from the west with a south wind behind it. Silas smelled it before he saw it, that flat, bitter taste of ash that makes animals lift their heads. The sky at the horizon turned brown at the bottom and orange above. Cedars could stop wind. Cedars could burn. Silas hitched Bishop to the plow and cut a fire break along the outer curve, tearing sod in a black line between dry grass and living trees. Toby soaked burlap in the rain barrel. Clara carried water to the weak places. The fire moved faster than fear could think. It reached the north arm before Silas finished the cut. The outer mulch caught. Then the lower cedar branches. They lost 19 trees in less than half an hour. 6 years of growth blackened into standing ribs. But the break held. The green interior did not carry flame. The spruce behind the burned row scorched but lived. The willows smoked and leafed again by June. The fire ran past the claim, ate 2 haystacks on another farm, and died in wet ground near the creek. Silas stood in the black strip after dark, his hands blistered, Toby's eyebrows singed, Clara's skirt burned at the hem. A wound in a windbreak was not merely damage. It was an invitation. He replanted before winter with 3-year cedar transplants from the nursery trench. Caleb brought 6 spruce without being asked. Sarah Thorne sent a crock of beans and a note that said only, "For the men who plant what keeps doors open." Gideon Pike sent a packet of government seedling forms with the useful parts already marked. The practice spread after the fire because the fire proved what the storm had not. It proved the crescent was not magic. It could be hurt. It could fail in sections. It required maintenance, replacement, water, labor, and humility. That made it more believable, not less. Men trusted a thing more when they saw what could wound it and how it recovered. Hollis Keene saw opportunity. He had spent years calling Silas's planting Redfern's broom. Now he copied the crescent drawing from an inspection board and advertised Redfern pattern shelter lots to new settlers for a fee. His version was wrong in almost every useful way. The arms were too short, the rows were too tight. He sold cheap cottonwood in place of cedar because he had cottonwood in stock. He told buyers to plant within 30 feet of the cabin so they could feel protection sooner, which meant snow would pack against the walls. Pike refused to certify the plans. Keene protested in the store, loud enough for everyone to hear. Pike answered just as loudly. "Mr. Keene, a wrong Shelterbelt is not a poor copy. It is a machine assembled backward." The room went still. Silas did not smile, but Toby did. That winter, Keene planted his own straight row behind the storehouse. 40 feet of willow and cottonwood set too close to the north wall. A January blow curled around both ends, shoved snow against the loading door, and tore the repaired shutter loose for the second time in 5 years. The drift took 3 men half a day to clear. Keene sent for Silas the next morning. He did not apologize. He stood behind the counter, eyes on the ledger, and said, "Mark it properly." Silas charged him $3, not because the knowledge was worth only $3, because Keene would not respect what he received for free. Silas used the money to buy cedar seedlings for a widow east of the creek whose son was too young to haul water alone. By 1896, The Redfern Crescent had become a landmark. People gave directions by it. Turn when you see the dark half-moon. Children walking to school during winter blows knew the calm pockets between farms the way other children knew berry patches. They learned where to stop, turn their backs, breathe, and continue. They did not call this engineering. They called it where the wind lets go. Clara became the settlement teacher and had her students draw wind lines before planting Arbor Day seedlings. Some children wanted to plant trees along the road because it looked pretty. Clara made them stand outside in a northwest breeze and watch the grass. Then she asked which side of the schoolhouse would need the trees in January. They remembered after that. Toby took over the nursery trench at 17. He could read a leaning cedar the way Silas read creek water. Too much west pressure, shallow roots, gap in the upper row, grass stealing moisture. He adjusted plantings on claims Silas's back could no longer walk. The frostbite from the 1890 storm had left Silas with a limp, and years of trench work had bent his shoulders forward as though he were always leaning into weather. He remarried late. Her name was Ruth Bell, a widow who knew root cellars, seed saving, and when to let a quiet man say less than he meant. She brought 2 hens, a milk cow, and a steadiness the cabin had not felt since Lydia. Clara liked her because Ruth never tried to replace the dead. Toby liked her because she sharpened tools correctly. Silas loved her for reasons he never explained well, except once when he told Anika's old knife in his pocket before speaking, and said Ruth made the house feel as if the storm was outside again. The cabin grew a lean-to kitchen. The crescent grew taller. The cedars at the windward center passed 20 feet. The spruce thickened until a man could stand on one side and not see a lantern on the other. The willows inside were coppiced for kindling and basket ribs. The plum cuttings Anika had brought bore small tart fruit that Clara turned into preserves and stored in the cellar Ruth had insisted on digging. The quarter section still produced less wheat than Caleb's. It also bought less cordwood, needed fewer roof repairs, lost fewer chickens to winter exposure, kept children healthy through cold snaps that sent others to bed coughing. By Silas's late years, Gideon Pike's inspection reports named more than 27 shelter plantings adapted from the Redfern curve, full crescents on open flats, L-shaped versions where a ridge helped, double rows where land was tight, extended arms near schoolhouses and barns. None were identical. That was the point. The wind line had to be read on each piece of ground. A copied shape was decoration. A fitted shape was shelter. Silas always said he had invented nothing. He had watched a hay rack panel break sleet, a hanging apron steady a stove flame, and old creek water spend itself around stone. Anika had taught him how to keep roots alive. The trees had done the rest, slowly and without speeches. In January of 1913, Silas was 67 and nearly blind in one eye. A northwest blow came in after midnight. Not a killing gale. A steady hard wind, 30 miles an hour or more, with powder snow combing low across the fields. Silas sat in the expanded cabin beside the stove and listened. He could tell the windward cedars by their deep, steady roar. He could tell the spruce by their higher hiss. He could tell when the gust shifted west because the long arm changed pitch. He heard Toby come in from checking the nursery and stamp snow from his boots. "The point row is bending," Toby said. Silas nodded. "Good." Toby looked at him. Silas smiled a little. "If it bends, it is working. That was the last winter he saw. He died the following spring after asking to be carried to the porch where he could hear the trees. Ruth sat beside him. Clara came from the schoolhouse. Toby stood at the end of the walk, not wanting his father to see him cry, forgetting his father could barely see at all. The wind moved through the crescent in a low green voice. Silas listened as if it were water over a mill race. Hollis Keene had been right about one thing. You cannot eat cedar needles. They do not turn into bread. They do not pay a store ledger directly. They do not hitch a mule, or mend a stove, or warm a child's hands by themselves. What they became was less obvious and more important. They became a door that opened during a gale. They became a stovepipe that drew clean. They became 4 extra hours for a fever to break. They became a pocket of quiet where snow fell soft instead of hard, where fruit trees lived, where children learned to stop and breathe on the way to school. Silas Redfern had not planted trees to stop the storm. He had planted a place where the storm had to spend itself before it reached the door.